Western governments frequently claim to be the model of democracy, and they demonize their geopolitical adversaries as authoritarian. Former US President Joe Biden claimed in his State of the Union address in 2022 that the US-led West is fighting a war between democracies and autocracies.
In the battle between democracy and autocracies, democracies are rising to the moment, and the world is clearly choosing the side of peace and security. This is the real test.
However, there's a very big problem with this narrative, which is that Western governments are not democracies, and especially the United States is not a democracy. And I don't mean that in the superficial sense when people say, the US, according to the Constitution, is not a democracy, it's actually a republic. That's not what I'm saying. What I mean is that if we take the definition of democracy as a system of government that is ruled by and for the people, representing the interests of the people of the country, the US is not a democracy. It is, in fact, an oligarchy or a plutocracy. The US system is one in which large corporations and economic elites and billionaires determine government policy, not average working people. And the same is true for countries in Europe and the broader collective West. Just because a country has elections doesn't mean that a country is actually democratic, especially considering that the candidates in those elections are overwhelmingly economic elites from large corporations and banks, and they're billionaires, or they represent the interest of billionaire oligarchs who fund their political campaigns. The Canadian Prime Minister is a millionaire banker, Mark Carney, who was previously the head of the central banks of the UK and Canada and worked at Goldman Sachs. The former Prime Minister of Italy, the last Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, is a millionaire banker from Goldman Sachs and the World Bank and the European Central Bank. France's millionaire president, Emmanuel Macron, is a banker as well. And the UK's last Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is the richest ever Prime Minister, nearly a billionaire, over $800 million of wealth. He started his career working at Goldman Sachs, and now he has gone back to work at Goldman Sachs. And in the United States, the rise of Donald Trump, who himself is a billionaire with 13 billionaires in his administration, he has become the perfect symbol of how the US is an oligarchy. But this did not start with Donald Trump. This goes back many decades, even centuries. And social scientists in the US and European countries have studied the impact of average people on government decision-making. And they have found, in the case of the US, that objectively speaking, the US is not a democracy. Objectively, according to scientific research, the US is an oligarchy. Social scientists at the elite US universities Princeton and Northwestern looked at a large data set consisting of 1,779 policy issues, and they published their research in a peer-reviewed elite academic journal. And they concluded, quote, multivariate analysis indicates that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on US government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. The results provide substantial support for theories of economic elite domination, not for theories of majoritarian electoral democracy, end quote. So, translated into simple English, what are they saying here? The data demonstrates that the US is an oligarchy. Average working people do not actually influence US government policy. Instead, it is economic elites and large corporations. And this is why you can look at issues like healthcare in the US, where for decades, poll after poll has showed the majority of Americans support universal healthcare, including a poll from July 2025 that found that 59%, 3/5 of Americans want Medicare for all, and only 27% of Americans, 1/4 of Americans, oppose Medicare for all. And yet, it's never going to happen, regardless of whether or not the president is a Democrat or Republican, because the private healthcare industry is so powerful and so large and donates so much money to politicians that they will never allow actual democracy and allow popular policies to be implemented if they go against the interests of these economic elites. And politicians who do try to challenge the oligarchy in the US usually lose elections because they don't have enough money, or when they actually win an election, the oligarchy funds politicians who remove them from office. And the organization Open Secrets studies the influence of money in US politics and found that in over 90% of the races in the House of Representatives and in over 80% of the races in the Senate, candidates who have more campaign contributions, that is donations from large corporations and billionaires, win the election. So in the case of the 2024 US elections, 94% of the top spending candidates in the House of Representatives won the election, and in the Senate, 88%. So this is not a democracy, or if you want to call it a democracy, this is the best so-called democracy that money can buy. This is by definition an oligarchy or a plutocracy in which a small handful of corporate oligarchs buy so-called elections. And this is especially the case after the 2010 Supreme Court ruling Citizens United, in which the US judicial system declared that corporations are people too, and there is no limit on the so-called free speech of corporations, and they define free speech as giving money to politicians. So the Supreme Court opened Pandora's box. They opened the floodgates and said there is no limit on the amount of campaign contributions, which in many countries would be considered bribery. It's illegal in many countries. But now corporations can fund politicians as much as they want. There is no limit. Billionaire oligarchs and other rich people can fund politicians as much as they want. So there is no democracy in the US. Again, it is objectively speaking an oligarchy or a plutocracy ruled by the rich. And Donald Trump has made this absolutely clear as day. Now, it's not just Trump. I want to be clear here. I'll talk in a few minutes here about the Democrats, Joe Biden and Barack Obama, and how they also served a small handful of corporations and economic elites. But Trump has just lifted the mask, and he's made it so clear by filling his administration with a dozen billionaires. First of all, I have to mention that Trump has pushed through executive orders that basically make bribery legal. He complained that anti-bribery laws in the US were hurting US corporations. So what Trump is really doing is just dragging the US back to the Gilded era of the late 19th century, when the US political system was largely controlled by a small handful of billionaire oligarchs who were then known as the robber barons. The equivalent of the robber barons today in the 21st century would be billionaire oligarchs like Elon Musk, the world's richest man, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Meta, which is the parent company of Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. And uncoincidentally, these are exactly the same billionaire oligarchs whom Trump invited to symbolically sit with his cabinet members at his inauguration in January 2025. And right after returning to the White House, Trump pushed through policies that benefited rich elites at the expense of everyone else, including his so-called Big Beautiful Bill, which was voted on by the House first, and then it was passed by the Senate in July. And this is one of the most blatant forms of class warfare that we've seen in many years. This law will massively slash taxes on the richest Americans. 72% of the tax cuts in this bill go to the richest 20% of Americans. 0% of the tax cuts go to the poorest 20% of Americans. The richer you are, the more Trump's policies benefit you. Thanks to Trump's tax cuts on the richest 1% of Americans will see their taxes cut by $66,000, whereas the poorest 20% of Americans will have their taxes cut by $40. 40. That's not a typo. And this comes after Trump already cut taxes on the super rich during his first administration. In 2019, during Trump's first term, a study found that due to Trump's tax cuts, billionaires in the US, the 400 richest families in the US, paid a lower average tax rate than the bottom half of Americans, of poor and working class Americans. Donald Trump's policies are literally the reverse of Robin Hood. It's taking wealth away from poor and working class people and giving it to the rich. Billionaires and corporate elites constantly fearmonger about left-wing politicians who want to redistribute wealth, but we're actually seeing redistribution. It's already happening, except it's redistribution from the poor to the rich by the government. This is oligarchy. And I have to say, it's not surprising when you look at the people who are making US government policy. Donald Trump appointed a billionaire from Wall Street, the hedge fund manager Scott Bessent, to run the US Department of the Treasury, to run US fiscal policy. And what's especially ironic about this is Scott Bessent got his career started working for the billionaire oligarch George Soros, who's one of the main funders of the Democratic Party and Democratic Party-linked organizations. But Trump didn't really care that Bessent was so closely linked to Soros because Trump knows that Soros is a billionaire like him, and they're all part of a small club of oligarchs who run the US government and other Western governments. This is actual capitalist so-called democracy. And during his first term as US president, Donald Trump appointed another oligarch from Wall Street to run the US Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, who has a wealth of over $400 million. And you know what Steve Mnuchin did before he became the head of US fiscal policy? He worked for Goldman Sachs, the powerful Wall Street investment bank. And Goldman Sachs is going to come back again and again and again, especially when I talk about the Canadian government and European governments, because the prime ministers and presidents of many other Western governments have also worked for the major Wall Street bank, Goldman Sachs. And this is true even of the right-wing so-called populists in the West. Steve Bannon, for instance, portrays himself proudly as a populist. And he was the CEO of Donald Trump's presidential campaign in 2016. And then when Trump entered the White House in 2017, Bannon served as his chief strategist. And yet, what was Bannon's background? Bannon also worked for Goldman Sachs, the Wall Street investment bank. And yet, Bannon claims to be a man of the people. He claims to care about the working class. But he's yet another Wall Street financier falsely posing as a populist. Another clear example of this is the Wall Street billionaire oligarch whom Trump appointed to be the US Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. And by the way, for people who claim that crypto is supposedly an alternative to this financial oligarchy, they're completely misguided, because this billionaire who's now the head of the US Commerce Department, Howard Lutnick, his Wall Street financial firm, Cantor Fitzgerald, is very deeply invested in crypto. And the largest Bitcoin fund in the world is managed by BlackRock, the biggest asset manager on earth, with over $12.5 trillion of assets under management. So crypto has been entirely taken over by Wall Street and the US government, which is essentially the same thing. I'm being redundant. Especially considering that now the US government is a billionaire oligarch who has his own crypto meme coin, and the US Treasury is run by the Wall Street billionaire Scott Bessent, and the US Commerce Department is run by the Wall Street billionaire Howard Lutnick. Wall Street is completely in charge. This is an oligarchy. But again, I have to stress that this did not start with Donald Trump. Trump is merely a symptom. He's not the cause. And the anti-poverty organization Oxfam, I think, put the situation very well. It wrote, quote, "For years, Oxfam, along with advocates and activists around the world, has argued that extreme concentration of wealth is leading to extreme concentration of power, allowing an ultra-rich few to tighten their grips on governments, economies, and media. Oligarchy is not created overnight. Decades of policies and politics across parties in favor of mega corporations and the ultra-rich have got us here. The ultra-richest segments in the US control a greater portion of wealth than they did during the Gilded Age. Just the top 5 billionaires today together own more than $1 trillion in wealth, end quote. And it's not just the Republicans who are responsible for this, but also the Democrats. And Joe Biden is a perfect example of this. When Biden was campaigning to be president in 2019, he brought together a bunch of rich donors from Wall Street at a luxurious hotel in Manhattan, and he promised them that he would not, quote, demonize, end quote, the rich. And Biden pledged, quote, no one's standard of living will change. Nothing would fundamentally change, end quote. Those were the inspiring words of the Democrat Joe Biden in 2019. And then a year later, in 2020, he won the presidential election. He beat Trump, and Biden was president for 4 years, and he violated most of his promises, but he did keep one promise, his most important promise, which was his pledge that nothing would fundamentally change. Nothing did fundamentally change. Just like how nothing fundamentally changed under his Democratic predecessor, Barack Obama. And let's not forget that in 2008, Wall Street was responsible for the worst financial crisis since 1929, since the Great Depression. And what was the response of Barack Obama? It was to bail out the Wall Street oligarchs that caused the crisis. And this is not surprising when you consider that in the 2008 presidential election, who were the biggest donors to Obama's campaign? Well, according to the website Open Secrets, number 2 was Goldman Sachs, the Wall Street investment bank. Number 4 was Microsoft, the Silicon Valley big tech monopoly. Number 5 was JP Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the US. Number 6 was Google, the mega tech monopoly. Number 7 was another Wall Street bank, Citigroup. But again, I want to be fair. It's not just the Democrats. It's also the Republicans. You know who Obama's Republican opponent was in the 2008 U.S. presidential election? It was the neoconservative Republican John McCain. And who were the biggest donors to his campaign? Merrill Lynch, the Wall Street investment firm that in 2008 was acquired by Bank of America. Number 2 was JP Morgan Chase. Number 3, Citigroup. Number 4, another Wall Street firm, Morgan Stanley. Number 6, Goldman Sachs. Number 8, another massive bank, UBS. Then fast forward to the 2012 election in the US, which Obama also won. And the second biggest donor to Obama's campaign was Microsoft. The third biggest was Google. And 2012 was a very revealing US presidential election because you had Obama, who bailed out Wall Street in 2009 and rescued the capitalist oligarchs who destroyed the economy. But who was Obama's opponent in 2012? The Republican Party's candidate was Mitt Romney, who was directly from Wall Street. He was the co-founder of the private equity fund Bain Capital. And if you look at Mitt Romney's major funders in his 2012 race, it was a who's who from Wall Street. Number 1, Goldman Sachs. Number 2, Bank of America. Number 3, Morgan Stanley. Number 4, JP Morgan. Number 5, Wells Fargo. Number 6, Credit Suisse. Number 7, Deloitte. Number 9, Citigroup. Number 10, UBS. I mean, this is an oligarchy. This is not a democracy. Now, I should note that another effect of the 2010 Citizens United ruling, in which the Supreme Court said that there's no limit on the amount of money that corporations can spend to buy politicians in the US, another effect of that ruling was the creation of super PACs, which made it easier for large corporations and billionaires to hide the money that they are donating to buy politicians, which is what they're doing. They're buying them off. Again, in many countries, this would be considered bribery. They're essentially bribing these politicians to make sure that they serve the interests of large corporations and economic elites. So after the 2012 election, it became harder to find who exactly was giving money to fund these politicians, to buy these politicians in the US. But even in the case of Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 presidential election, the biggest donor to his campaign who bought him off was Bloomberg, founded and run by the billionaire oligarch of the same name, Michael Bloomberg. More than $94 million of donations went to Biden's campaign through Bloomberg. And in the case of Donald Trump's 2024 presidential campaign, the three biggest donors were all massively powerful billionaire oligarchs, including SpaceX, which is obviously Elon Musk, the world's richest oligarch, funneling money through SpaceX to Trump. And then number two was Timothy Mellon, the billionaire oligarch from the powerful Mellon dynasty. And number three was Miriam Adelson, the widow of Sheldon Adelson, another billionaire oligarch. Adelson gave Trump over $100 million. Mellon gave Trump $150 million. And Elon Musk, the world's richest oligarch, donated $288 million to get Trump elected in 2024. And he has since boasted, and he's probably right, that if Musk had not campaigned for Trump and given him all that money, Trump probably would have lost.
Elon Musk posting on X, his social media platform, "Without me, Trump would have lost the election. Dems would control the House and the Republicans would be 51-49 in the Senate." He goes on to post two words, "such ingratitude."
So this is essentially the world's richest man boasting of how he bought the White House. And of course, just a few months later, Trump and Musk had a political falling out. So now Musk created his own political party, which he calls the America Party. So he's going to try to buy politics through his own political party. This, again, is an oligarchy. And anytime you have a rare politician who tries to challenge the corporate oligarchs who run the US, they wage brutal political and economic war against that politician. A good example of this is the self-declared Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani, who won the Democratic Party's primary to be mayor of New York. Now, he did not win the actual election yet to be mayor of New York, just the primary, but immediately after the people of New York City voted for him, and he won in a landslide, a bunch of billionaire and centimillionaire oligarchs in New York, from Wall Street largely, all got together and said, what can we do to raise $20 million to prevent this left-wing politician from actually becoming mayor, despite the fact that the people voted for him in the primary? As the Wall Street Journal put it in a report, quote, "New York's financial crowd rushes to build anti-Mamdani war chest. A new group plans to raise at least $20 million to stop the Democratic Socialist in the mayoral race," end quote. Once again, this is oligarchy. Let's not forget what happened to the most popular politician in the US. Do you know who that is? It was Bernie Sanders. In 2017, a poll found that Bernie Sanders, the self-declared Democratic Socialist, was the single most popular politician in the US. And yet, what did the Democratic Party do to Sanders in the 2016 primary race? The leadership of the Democratic Party, the DNC, sabotaged the most popular politician in the US because the corporate oligarchs who own the Democratic Party, who fund and buy politicians who lead the DNC, were afraid of the left-wing message of Bernie Sanders, and they sabotaged his campaign undemocratically. Internal DNC emails were published by WikiLeaks, and it was incontrovertible evidence that the Democratic Party had conspired to sabotage his campaign, and the DNC was actually forced to issue an apology, a formal public apology to Sanders, but it didn't change anything because the Democratic Party leadership had already succeeded in anointing the right-wing candidate Hillary Clinton as the party's candidate. And of course, she lost the 2016 presidential election to Donald Trump. And Trump and Clinton were the least popular candidates in recorded history for as long as they had been doing polls of US presidential candidates. Both of them were the least popular candidates. But the billionaire oligarchs and large corporations that own the Democratic Party, that fund it and own it essentially, would rather lose the election to Trump because they knew that Trump would cut their taxes, rather than allowing a left-wing candidate like Bernie Sanders to become president. But now I want to move to Europe, because I spent a lot of time here talking about how the US is an oligarchy. But it's not just the United States. Some people in Europe love to point to the US and say, oh, the US is so corrupt. And they're right that the US is so corrupt and the political system is so undemocratic. But European so-called democracies are also very undemocratic. They are also oligarchies and plutocracies in which capitalist oligarchs control the political system. And all we have to do is look at what happened in the United Kingdom to Jeremy Corbyn, who was the most popular leader of the Labour Party in decades, but because he was a socialist and he supported left-wing policies going against the corporate oligarchs who run the UK, he was also sabotaged by his own party, by the Labour Party. This was admitted in internal documents that were leaked from the Labour Party. And then the leading British newspaper, The Guardian, which spread vicious anti-Corbyn propaganda for years and is linked to the right wing of the Labour Party, which it's a propaganda organ for, The Guardian published an article in 2024 boasting about how the elites inside the Labour Party, which are closely linked to corporate oligarchs and the City of London, the financial oligarchy, they boasted of how they sabotaged Corbyn when he was elected in a landslide by the rank and file members of the Labour Party to be the leader. This article was titled, quote, "Corbyn had flown too close to the sun, how Labour insiders battled the left and plotted the party's path back to power," end quote. However, it wasn't just the corporate elites in the Labour Party who sabotaged Corbyn, but also the British intelligence agencies. Corbyn himself discussed how he had briefings with MI5 and MI6, which are the internal and external intelligence agencies, the spy agencies of the UK. And then in those private meetings, the information that Corbyn disclosed was leaked by these British spies in order to sabotage him. This is the British regime violating democracy blatantly on behalf of the corporate oligarchy. And furthermore, Corbyn revealed that in these meetings, the US spy agencies threatened him because Corbyn is an anti-imperialist. Unlike Bernie Sanders, Corbyn is a consistent decades-long anti-imperialist and a longtime anti-war activist, and one of the leaders of the Stop the War coalition in the UK. And he revealed that the US spy agencies threatened him because he opposed the UK's involvement in the proxy war in Syria. Now, some critics of Corbyn would say, oh, he just fabricated that. Well, the British investigative journalist Matt Kennard of the very good website Declassified UK looked into this issue and he found lots and lots of evidence. He found 34 major news stories in the UK in which officials in the UK military and intelligence establishment were smearing Corbyn as a so-called danger to British security. So here we have dozens of examples of British spies and military officers using the media as a political weapon to sabotage Corbyn to prevent him from becoming prime minister. And ultimately, they succeeded. Because again, the UK is not a democracy. It's an oligarchy. And just like Trump is the perfect symbol of the oligarchy in the US, the UK's former prime minister, Rishi Sunak, is the perfect symbol of the oligarchy in the United Kingdom. Rishi Sunak was the prime minister for the Conservative Party, and just a few months after leaving office, he got a new job working for, drumroll, Goldman Sachs. I mentioned earlier that the name would come back again and again and again. This is the massive Wall Street investment bank, and many politicians in the US and in Europe have worked for Goldman Sachs. I'm reading here from a report in the Financial Times in July. It notes, former UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is set to join Goldman Sachs as a senior advisor. This job marks a return to the Wall Street investment bank for Sunak, who spent the early years of his career there from 2001 to 2004, first as a summer intern, then as a junior analyst. So this was his first job. Wall Street, Goldman Sachs, helped to cultivate the future prime minister of the British oligarchy. And this article noted that in his new capacity working for this Wall Street investment bank, Sunak is going to advise wealthy clients on geopolitical and economic issues. So he's going to cash in on his internal contacts in the British oligarchic regime and help rich oligarchs around the world profit from his insider information, which is legal because Western governments are oligarchies and plutocracies, not democracies. Fortune magazine published another article noting that Rishi Sunak was the richest ever prime minister of the UK, and he's working now at Goldman Sachs, after he made $668,000 in 3 months from speaking to a few Wall Street firms. Fortune magazine noted that Rishi Sunak and his wife together have $870 million worth of wealth. They're nearly billionaires, very close to it. In a few years, they'll likely be billionaires thanks to their political ties in the British oligarchy. And this article noted that Sunak has been working with the Washington Speakers Bureau, and in April and May 2025, he was paid $668,000 for giving 3 speeches to Wall Street firms, including a speaking engagement for Bain Capital. Does that name sound familiar? I mentioned it earlier because Bain Capital was founded by Mitt Romney, the private equity manager from Wall Street, who was the Republican Party's presidential candidate in 2012, running against Barack Obama. So his company, Bain Capital, is paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to the former Prime Minister of the UK, Rishi Sunak, for giving a speaking engagement and clearly providing information and making contacts that will help Wall Street insiders to make more money. They see the hundreds of thousands of dollars they're spending as an investment because, again, this kind of activity that would be considered illegal in many countries, it would be considered corruption. It's totally common in Western regimes because they're not democracies, they're oligarchies and plutocracies. And today, the UK's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is a puppet of the corporate oligarchy. He represents the right wing of the Labour Party, who sabotaged Corbyn, and he's an obedient puppet also of the US that does whatever the US wants. And although he's the leader of the so-called Labour Party, he's going against the interest of the working class in basically every single way, just like the former right-wing leader of the Labour Party, Tony Blair, who supported the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. Keir Starmer is the reincarnation of Tony Blair, with even less charisma this time. You know, history repeats itself. First time is tragedy, second time is farce. And Keir Starmer has been implementing neoliberal austerity measures, including he cut winter fuel subsidies for elderly retirees in the UK while serving the interests of corporate oligarchs. Again, this is not a democracy. Now, I've spent a lot of time here talking about the US oligarchy and the UK oligarchy. Let's talk about other oligarchies in Europe. Let's start with France. In 2017, the French elected the millionaire banker who is the perfect symbol of European oligarchy. And soon after coming to power as president, the banker Macron eliminated the wealth tax in France. And what was the result? Well, Forbes magazine put it this way, quote, "France's rich got much richer after abolition of wealth tax," end quote. Surprise, surprise. This report noted that Macron's government tried to justify eliminating the wealth tax by appealing to the idea of trickle-down economics, claiming that by cutting wealth taxes on the rich, that they would invest more and it would lead to economic growth and job growth. That's not what happened. Instead, poverty has been rising quickly in France as the rich get richer and richer. But of course, we knew that this would happen because this is exactly what happened in the United States with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and with Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom in the 1980s. This trickle-down economics was the same old tired ideology of neoliberalism, free market fundamentalism that was brought in the 1980s that has devastated economies across the West and has really hurt working class people and only strengthened these economic corporate oligarchies. And by the way, the French government itself created a committee for the evaluation of capital tax reforms and investigated the impact of the elimination of the wealth tax under Macron. And this government committee came to the reluctant conclusion that there is no evidence whatsoever that this benefited the economy in any way. It did not lead to greater economic growth, yet alone to positive benefits for poor and working class French people. The exact opposite happened. Their quality of living fell as the rich got richer. This is according to a government study that was published in 2022, 4 years after the elimination of the wealth tax. This is exactly why France's left-wing opposition leader, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, has dubbed Macron the president of the rich. And even Politico magazine, one of the most mainstream media outlets in the West, acknowledged in an article, quote, Macron really is the president of the rich, end quote, looking at results of voting patterns and finding that the rich overwhelmingly support Macron. And even when he loses elections because the people vote against his right-wing policies in support of the rich, he still clings on to power, which is exactly what happened in 2024. There were snap parliamentary elections that were called by Macron himself. His party lost those elections. The left-wing coalition, the Popular Front, won those elections. They got more votes than any other bloc of parties. And what happened? Macron ignored the election results and he handpicked a right-wing oligarch candidate from an extremely unpopular party. They got very few votes. And this is why there were massive protests in France. And people in France were accusing Macron of stealing the election and of carrying out a political coup and ruling as a dictator. So that's the oligarchy in France. Let's go next door in Europe to Germany, which is also an oligarchy. Do you know who Germany's current prime minister is? He's the right-wing politician Friedrich Merz. And do you know what his background was? Merz previously was the chair of the German arm of BlackRock. Again, BlackRock is the world's largest asset manager. It's probably the most powerful financial corporation on earth. It has over $12.5 trillion of assets under management. And one of the biggest drivers in the growth of assets managed by BlackRock has been crypto. Again, crypto is not an alternative. It's part of the problem. BlackRock manages the world's largest Bitcoin fund, which is the BlackRock Bitcoin ETF. And the oligarch who previously ran BlackRock's German arm, Friedrich Merz, is now the political leader of the German oligarchy. And this is an article from an Irish newspaper. It describes Merz as a conservative millionaire. It notes he was a corporate lawyer for many years, and he owns 2 private jets. This article noted, by the way, that Merz had never served as a government minister in Germany, and now he's running the German government. And his right-wing party, the CDU, the Christian Democrat Party, only got 28% of the vote in the election, but they managed to form a governing coalition because, again, this is an oligarchy. It's not a democracy. All right, so I've talked about the US, the UK, France, and Germany. Let's talk about Italy, another oligarchy in Europe. Italy's previous prime minister was Mario Draghi. Who is Mario Draghi? He is another millionaire who was the longtime president of the European Central Bank. He's a complete neoliberal market fundamentalist, and he was previously the governor of the Bank of Italy, and he was the executive director of the World Bank, and of course, he was a vice chairman and managing director for Goldman Sachs, another name that keeps coming back, the Wall Street investment bank. And because he was a loyal servant of the corporate oligarchy in Europe, he became prime minister of Italy, and he governed Italy on behalf of these corporate oligarchs. Here is a 2002 post on the Goldman Sachs website titled, Professor Mario Draghi joins Goldman Sachs. It noted that he was being appointed vice chairman of Goldman Sachs International, and it noted that this future prime minister of Italy, quote, will help the firm develop and execute business with major European corporations and with governments and government agencies worldwide, end quote. So this is the revolving door between Wall Street and Western governments because they're oligarchies and they serve the interests of Wall Street, not average working people. Now, finally, before I conclude here, I want to talk about one other Western oligarchy. I've talked about the US, the UK, France, Germany, and Italy, which are all oligarchies. Let's talk about Canada in North America. Canada's current prime minister, the Liberal prime minister since March 2025, is Mark Carney. Like Mario Draghi, like so many other Western officials I've named, Mark Carney previously worked at Goldman Sachs, the major Wall Street investment bank. Mark Carney also was the governor of the Bank of Canada and the governor of the Bank of England. So he was the governor of two different Western central banks, implementing monetary policy on behalf of Western oligarchs and the commercial banks. And he had citizenship not only of Canada, but also citizenship of the UK and Ireland. And he gave up his other citizenship to become the Prime Minister of Canada. And now he's governing Canada on behalf of the Canadian oligarchy and the US oligarchy, because the Canadian oligarchy is basically just an extension of the US corporate oligarchy on Wall Street. So let's summarize here. The US president, Donald Trump, is a billionaire, and there are a dozen billionaires in his administration. The Canadian Prime Minister is a millionaire banker who was previously the head of the central banks of the UK and Canada and worked at Goldman Sachs. The former Prime Minister of Italy, the last Prime Minister, Mario Draghi, is a millionaire banker from Goldman Sachs and the World Bank and the European Central Bank. France's millionaire president, Emmanuel Macron, is a banker as well. And the UK's last Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is the richest ever Prime Minister, nearly a billionaire, over $800 million of wealth. He started his career working at Goldman Sachs, and now he has gone back to work at Goldman Sachs. Meanwhile, the head of the US Treasury, Scott Bessent, is a billionaire from Wall Street who worked for hedge funds, including for the billionaire funder of the Democratic Party, George Soros. And the US Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, is another billionaire oligarch from Wall Street who is heavily invested in crypto. And now the US government is also getting deeply invested in crypto. So the moral of the story here is that these Western regimes are not democracies. They are oligarchies. They are plutocracies. Government policy is not made on behalf of working class people. Policy is made on behalf of a small handful of capitalist oligarchs because, again, capitalism is not democratic. When you have a capitalist system, your political system cannot be a democracy. It is inevitably an oligarchy and a plutocracy. And just like in the late 19th century in the US, we saw the robber barons completely dominated US politics. Today, it's becoming completely undeniable that the US is an oligarchy. But as I've been stressing throughout this analysis today, it's not just the United States and it's not just Trump. These Western so-called democracies are not democracies. They are plutocratic oligarchies, and they demonize their geopolitical adversaries as horrible so-called authoritarian regimes, when in reality, these Western regimes are deeply authoritarian and undemocratic. On that note, I'm going to conclude here. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.